April 3rd, 1944. Midday heat baked the rails. Outside Aliceville, Alabama, a long, rattling troop train eased into the siding and came to a shuddering stop. The air smelled of hot metal, pine tar, and the faint sweetness of cigars. Inside the cars, German uniforms hung limp on tired bodies. Feldgrau jackets patched at the elbows. Caps crushed and sweat darkened. Boots scuffed with the mud of a dozen foreign fields. Bloinant. Carl Fischer pressed his forehead to the steel slat of the car window and watched the world slide by with the brittle curiosity of a man who had seen too many horizons, but never this one. When the doors opened, it was like stepping out into a photograph of abundance. Sunlight cut the dust in sharp blades. Men in short-sleeved shirts and paper hats from a nearby diner flicked their hands at each other, like they were sharing a private joke. Women in cotton dresses, hair pinned up against the heat, pushed baby carriages along sidewalks that were astonishingly. There was no rubbish piled in corners, no shattered glass, no rotting refuse that Carl had been conditioned to expect from wartime propaganda. The concrete was swept. The storefront windows gleamed. A boy with a freckled nose offered a stick of peppermint to a perched German who had never seen such a thing in years. Was Eistes Oberfeld? Wibbelhans Muller asked, turning the wrapper over as if it were a rare coin. His voice carried the rough cadence of a village drill sergeant. His eyes, at 35, had learned to read battlefields in the way some men read scripture. Around him, other prisoners shuffled down the gangways, half expecting a trap, half expecting the rear echelon to crawl out from behind a curtain and shout Gestapo. Nothing like that came. Instead, a sergeant in a tan uniform with a badge that read SGT, Thomas Reed, waved them forward with an easy, almost embarrassed smile. His rifle hung loose across his chest. His face was not carved into the severe lines of the frontline officer. He smelled of soap and machine oil. The first shock was small and domestic. The way white shirts smelled clean. The whir of a soda fountain from a nearby drugstore. The clack of a baseball on a tin bat across an empty lot. Men, who had been conditioned by leaflets and loudspeakers to view Americans as decadent, dissolute, and sullenly defeated, now watched housewives hanging out sheets that gleamed in the sun like flags. A Methodist church bell chimed the hour. A milkman's horse snorted and stamped in the lane. A dog barked. Not the frantic, scavenging bark of a city stray, but a healthy, well-fed bark. Collars on the animals caught German eyes like punctuation. This confusion showed on faces. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker, who had once led a patrol through the ruined shells of a French village, squinted at the storefronts. Els, so sober, he muttered, the German crispness turning to wonder. He ran a thumb over the hem of his sleeve, where dirt had seeped months ago, and come away clean as if by magic. Around him, a murmur threaded through the column, a low, incredulous tide. Some of the younger men laughed, brittle with exhaustion, as if laughter could fold the scene into something they could handle. Others went quiet, eyes narrowed in the way soldiers do when they sift for deception. The camp beyond the town rows of barracks ringed by barbed wire and watchtowers was not the ugly maw they had been warned of, either. It was organized, efficient. Laundry lines where clothing snapped in the breeze. Latrines scrubbed to white. A vegetable garden where prisoners tended neat rows of cabbages under the supervision of a civilian foreman with a gentle Irish drawl. Mess halls served steaming plates of roast, potatoes, and pie. When the first trays arrived, some Germans whispered that it must be a trick. Others, famished, ate before their skepticism could reassemble itself. Interactions came slowly at first. The guards corporal and sergeant, mostly, not the caricatured monsters of propaganda, moved among them, with a professionalism that bordered on courtesy. Names were exchanged awkwardly, titles translated in halting syllables. Ich heiße Hans Muller, Hans would say, and the guard would reply, I'm Tom Reed. The names were a bridge. The small kindnesses followed. A guard who remembered being fed by his own grandmother stopped to show a prisoner how to peel an apple without wasting the skin. A local farmer, invited to teach the prisoners to mend fence, spent an afternoon laughing at the men's attempts to mimic his American drawl. That evening, the prisoners were marched to the recreation field. Baseball again. A dozen Americans shouting, laughing, their movements loose and confident. On the sidelines, a group of Germans stood watching, trying to decipher the strange choreography of bats and gloves. One of the guards, a lanky corporal named Jimmy, tossed a ball toward them. "Come on, try," he said with a grin. At first, no one moved. Then, Hans stepped forward, catching the ball clumsily, his fingers stiff with uncertainty. The Americans clapped, teasing good. Within minutes, laughter replaced language barriers. The simple act of play, unarmed, unguarded, became something profound. That night, the Germans couldn't stop talking about it. "Did you see how they laughed with us?" one whispered in the barracks. "They don't hate us." Or maybe, Karl murmured, staring at the ceiling, "they don't need to." It was an idea that unsettled him more than any battlefield could. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a decaying land of mongrels and weaklings, incapable of unity or discipline. Yet everything around him said the opposite. A people rich enough to treat even their enemies with dignity. Weeks became months. The Alabama heat baked the roofs, and the men adjusted. They planted flowers outside their barracks, built chessboards, carved trinkets from wood. A choir formed, singing hymns in the evenings that drifted over the wire and mixed with the distant murmur of American music from a nearby town. Then came Sunday. The prisoners were marched to a small outdoor chapel built by the Red Cross. A local preacher stood before them, Bible in hand, translating his words through a volunteer interpreter. His sermon wasn't about victory or vengeance. It was about forgiveness. The line that struck Karl deepest was simple. You can tell the strength of a people, not by how they fight, but by how they treat the defeated. For the first time, the prisoners understood that the clean streets they had seen outside the camp weren't just about tidiness or wealth. They were symbols of order, of faith in progress, of a society that didn't collapse under pressure. That night, Karl wrote in his journal, "Greater than, if this is the nation we were told was rotting from within, then our truth has been a lie. We have been fighting ghosts made of ink and shouting." He didn't show anyone those words, but others too were beginning to sense it. A quiet, dangerous thought spreading through the camp. Maybe the enemy wasn't what they had been told. By late summer of 1944, the Alabama air hung thick with heat and the scent of pine. Cicadas screamed in the trees inside the POW camp. The days had grown strangely predictable, so ordinary that they began to unsettle the Germans even more than the initial shock. Every morning brought a glimpse of a world that shouldn't exist in wartime. Trains running on time, farmers in clean shirts heading to town, children laughing in the distance. Even through the barbed wire, America's calm order pressed against their senses like sunlight through glass. It was impossible to ignore. Flynet Carl Fisher began to notice the smallest details. A civilian truck bringing supplies to the camp was painted with bright advertisements for the driver whistled the same tune each morning, something jazzy, cheerful, carefree. Karl asked him one day, through halting English, why he seemed so happy when the world was burning. The man just smiled. "Because," he said, "we're not fighting here." That sentence haunted Karl. The war had hollowed Europe's cities, shattered, roads gutted, fields cratered. Yet here, America's roads were smooth, its shops full, its people unafraid. How could a country fighting across two oceans remain untouched, even thriving? It was more than material wealth. It was will. A quiet, organized, relentless will. In the barracks, the Germans whispered comparisons. In Bremen, there's rubble. In Hamburg, the sky burns at night. And here, even their fences are painted. Hans Muller, ever the skeptic, tried to reason it away. They have oceans to protect them, he said. They didn't suffer the bombings. But another voice, softer, replied, maybe they built something stronger than fear. Letters from home began to trickle, uncensored, fragmented, but enough to show the contrast. Families wrote of shortages, of cold winters, of cities turned to ash. The men read these words while sitting in a camp where even the grass was trimmed, and the guards offered second helpings of pie. It was unbearable. Guilt and wonder tangled like barbed wire around their thoughts. Then came a Red Cross visit, and with it, something that broke many of them completely. Newspapers, American newspapers. Carl held one carefully, its ink smudging his fingertips. The front page showed photos of soldiers returning from North Africa, smiling, waving from ships draped in bunting. Below that, advertisements for refrigerators, washing machines, and summer dresses. Refrigerators in wartime. In Germany, factories that once built cars and appliances now struggled to churn out rifles. Civilians queued for bread that might not come. And yet, the supposed decadent Americans were still buying luxuries, still innovating, still building. It became clear what the Nazi regime had hidden. America's industrial heart was unstoppable. While Germany strained under scarcity, the US was flooding the world with ships, tanks, planes, and still had enough left over for soda, movies, and ice cream. For many POs, the psychological war was over right then. Their faith in the Reich's superiority cracked. Not through bombs or interrogations, but through the quiet power of comfort and cleanliness. Hans, once a believer, stared at a photo of a smiling American family outside a new suburban home. They said these people were slaves to money, he muttered, but they look free. That night, the men sat outside their barracks, watching lightning bugs drift above the grass. Beyond the wire, the faint glow of a nearby town shimmered on the horizon. Music floated faintly. Benny Goodman on a radio. Maybe. It sounded impossibly gentle. Carl broke the silence. Do you remember what Goebbels said? That America is decadent, divided, dying. Yes, Hans replied. Carl nodded slowly. Then what is this? No one answered, because everyone knew. The men still wore their uniforms, still saluted out of habit, but the old certainty, the iron belief that Germany's way was the future, had dissolved. They began to see the guards differently, not as conquerors, but as examples of something rare. Men secure enough to be kind. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't demand loyalty. They simply lived well. And that, more than any speech or victory parade, became the most powerful propaganda of all. When the war finally began to turn, when whispers of Normandy and the fall of Paris reached the camp, no one cheered or cursed. They just went quiet, each man retreating into his thoughts. The world they had believed in was gone. Carl, staring at the clean gravel path leading to the mess hall, realized something profound. The battle for truth had been lost long before their capture. It had been lost the moment they had chosen to believe lies about a nation they'd never seen. And now, standing in a camp surrounded by order, food, and civility, they finally understood the truth. The enemy they had been told to despise had built a world worth living in. By the spring of 1945, the war was ending. Word of Hitler's death came quietly, passed from guard to prisoner like a fragile secret. No one celebrated. Some refused to believe it. Others simply sat down, staring into the dust. The camp loudspeakers, usually used for roll call and radio music, now carried news bulletins from Europe. Berlin in ruins, the Reich in fragments, surrender imminent. For the men behind the wire, the silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. Carl Fischer walked the perimeter fence one afternoon, hands behind his back, tracing his steps along the same gravel path he had paced for months. Beyond the wire, the Alabama fields stretched green and endless, dotted with white farmhouses. A breeze lifted the smell of cut grass, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistled. It was an ordinary sound, but to him it felt like the sound of the world moving on. He thought of Bremen, of bombed-out streets and crumbling chimneys. He thought of his mother's last letter, written in careful script. We have no milk now. We make soup from potatoes and pray for peace. And here, on the other side of the world, children rode bicycles down clean roads, and licked ice cream from cones. Hans Muller joined him, lighting a cigarette. The two stood in silence for a long time. "Do you ever wonder," Hans asked finally, "if we were the unlucky ones or the lucky ones?" Karl didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the open land, where farmers moved in steady rhythm, their lives untouched by the war's ash. "Both," he said at last. "Unlucky to have fought for lies, lucky to have lived long enough to see the truth." Rumors, however, moved faster than the truth. In the evenings, clustered under the open Alabama sky, small groups of men traded what they had learned in terse, conspiratorial phrases. They said America was rotten. One would say they lied. Another would answer. And the conversation would swell into Lisclean streets. Plenty of bread. Children who waved and did not cower. For veterans whose world had been narrowed to foxholes and ration lines, these were not idle curiosities. They were fissures. The neatness of an American grocery, the abundance of canned fruit on a shop shelf, the soft white bread that had once been the stuff of rumor, each item pressed against the stories that had kept them fighting and contradicted them by night. Under the electric hum of the barrack lights, men folded these sights into memory in the sharp, painful way that memory reshapes belief. Some, like Karl, treated it as a wound. Others as a small, secret joy. None could dismiss it. The propaganda that had painted America as a decayed, corrupt enemy state tales of breadlines, of slums and moral rot began to look less like ironclad doctrine and more like the brittle paper it had always been. The first thin cracks had shown, the deeper ones would trace themselves across minds in the months to come. But the detonator had been a child's outstretched hand and a peppermint stick. By the second week, the routine had settled in like the hum of cicadas across the Alabama fields. Every morning at 0600, a whistle shrieked through the camp. German prisoners formed ranks in the pale dawn light. Boots aligned, the air smelling faintly of dew and soap. The Americans did roll call with an almost casual precision. Names checked, heads counted, salutes exchanged with none of the barked cruelty that the men had come to expect from authority. Karl Fischer still found it strange, the ease of it all. No blows, no insults, no arbitrary punishments. Instead, guards offered cigarettes and joked about baseball, trying to explain a game that made no sense to anyone raised on football and marching drills. There was discipline here, yes, but it was orderly, almost humane, for men who had been raised under the iron hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. This felt like some impossible contradiction. Strength without brutality. The camp itself was a study in paradoxes. It was fenced with barbed wire and patrolled by armed men. Yet it breathed with a peculiar freedom. Prisoners were assigned to work details tending gardens, building furniture, even repairing local roads under supervision. But they were paid in canteen credits, enough to buy soap, writing paper, or the occasional candy bar. Some used their credits to mail letters home, others to trade for the smooth taste of American tobacco. Hans Muller had been a strict non-smoker all his life, but the first puff of a lucky strike nearly made him weep. "It tastes like peace," he said, half joking. And the men around him laughed, the tired laugh of those who had forgotten what peace even smelled like. At noon, they ate in the mess hall, and it was here that the next shock began to take root. Rows of tables lined with steaming trays, meatloaf, potatoes, beans, coffee, strong enough to stir the dead. Some couldn't eat at first. They stared, suspicious. Food, real food, was something rationed in Germany, a ghost of the pre-war years. But the guards sat down with them, ate from the same pots, and talked about home. "Detroit," one said proudly. "We make cars, or used to, before the war." Karl listened. Fork paused midair. Cars, machines, cities of light. He remembered what the party newspapers had printed. Tales of American chaos, unemployment, filth, and crime. Yet here was a man from that same America, speaking of industry, of families, of small towns that smelled of steel and ambition. It was the voice of a man who had never known starvation. The camp changed after that. Guards grew less strict, work details lighter. The war's end loosened everything. Uniforms grew wrinkled, salutes forgotten. Some prisoners helped local farmers. Others built furniture for the nearby town. One day, a group of German POs repaired the local schoolhouse roof. After a storm, the children brought them lemonade, curious and unafraid. One little girl drew them a picture of the American and German flags, side by side, smiling suns above both. Franz laughed when he saw it. "Even the children here don't hate," he said softly. As repatriation began, trains once again lined the rails outside the camp. But this time, the mood was different. Men stood straighter, not out of pride, but understanding. They had come here as enemies and would leave as witnesses to something their people had been denied. The truth about America, about what freedom actually looked like. Before departure, an American officer addressed them through a translator. His voice carried across the camp, calm and respectful. "You have fought bravely," he said. "Now you return to rebuild. I hope when you go home, you remember that not every enemy is as he is described." It was a simple farewell, but for many, those words struck deeper than any sermon. The train that took them north rolled past small American towns, white fences, tidy porches, waving flags. Civilians stood by the tracks to watch. Some waved, others simply stared, but none spat or jeered. The Germans watched in silence, their faces pressed to the glass. Karl took out his notebook, the same one he had been writing in since his capture, and began his final entry. "Greater than, we came to America, believing it to be a land of chaos and corruption. We leave, knowing it is something else entirely. Its strength is not only in its weapons, but in its character, in the way it treats even those who sought its destruction. I will remember the clean streets, the laughter of children, the taste of their bread, and I will tell my son, if I live to see him again, that the world is not as the loudest men describe it." When the train crossed the final stretch before New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning haze. It stood silent, immense, indifferent. Yet, to the men watching from the windows, it seemed to look back at them with something like understanding. Karl turned to Hans. "Do you think we'll ever see anything like this again?" Hans shook his head. "Not for a long time." The ship that carried them home left the dock in calm water. Behind them, the American coast faded into blue, the clean lines of the land receding like a dream. Ahead lay a Europe, still bleeding, still broken. But inside every man on that ship, a seed had been planted, a memory of decency, of order, of a world that didn't need to shout to prove its power. Years later, when some of those former POs returned to visit America, now gray-haired, carrying their children or grandchildren, they searched again for those same clean streets. And when they found them, still gleaming, still full of life, they smiled with quiet recognition. Because long before peace was signed, long before flags were lowered, they had already seen what true victory looked like. And it did not wear a uniform.